Hey, what's going on everyone? My name's Lucas. Welcome to my studio. In this video, I'm going to be doing a detailed comparison between Ableton Live 12 and Studio One 7. These are the two hottest new DAWs out right now. Both of them just received substantial updates, and I'm really excited to get into it. If you want to directly support the channel, definitely check out the link in the description to my website. I have templates up for sale, as well as a new Apollo console video course that I just posted up there that'll help you get your money's worth if you're using Apollo. Just a little quick background about this video. I've been planning this for a really long time, and Ableton and Presonus just released major updates, so it's the perfect time to go through this. These two DAWs are the most compelling offerings on the market right now, actually, so I'm super excited. I'm stoked to do this video. I really hope this will help people. Definitely let me know in the comments. Alright, so first section is getting started and learning curve. I just want to note a couple things about Ableton. So Ableton's a great DAW to start out with if you're new to this. I think most things are fairly easy to understand, and they have great resources for learning how to do pretty much anything. The other thing I wanted to mention is that Ableton is super fast to open up. So if you're trying to catch inspiration, opening Ableton is the fastest out of any other DAW, so you can really catch those song ideas. So from a standpoint of getting started, getting everything up and running, learning curve, Ableton is a great DAW. All right, so just a couple things about the learning curve and kind of getting up and running with Studio One. So Studio One definitely has a bit more going on than Ableton. That being said, it is a very smooth and sleek DAW to learn how to use, and the learning curve is pretty quick. So even though there's a lot going on, you can definitely get up and running and just do some basic recording and beat making. Both of the programs have a help view, which is really nice because you can learn while you're doing stuff. But the one in Ableton is much, much better and much easier to use. So I would say getting up and running in Studio One, probably a little bit harder than Ableton, but in the grand scheme of DAWs, it is a very, very user-friendly program. Next, we'll get into the design. All right, section number 2 is design. So we're gonna look at Ableton, and the design of Ableton is very, very good. Ableton's kind of the benchmark for modern DAWs. They have kind of a minimalistic approach to everything, and it has a very sleek look. I'm gonna go through some of the design elements of Ableton so you can get an idea of whether or not this is gonna work for you. So on our top panel, we have basically our transport buttons and controls, so things like metronome, starting and stopping playback, looping, punching in, and things like that. They do have kind of small buttons in Ableton that some people might not like that aspect, but really everything that you need is there, and a lot of stuff that other DAWs have cluttering things up is gone. So we have a really, really good tap tempo button right here. We can choose keys and scales, and we just basically have this transport up here on the top. On the left-hand side in Ableton, we have a browser. So this is one of the highlights of Ableton, and I'm gonna talk about this in detail in its own dedicated section. On the bottom section, we have a clip device view, which is very unique to Ableton. Not many other DAWs have this, and it's very, very useful. In the center, we have our main arrangement view, or if you press tab, you can switch to your session view, which a lot of people like to use for DJing or looping or playing live. There is no right side panel here. Some other DAWs may have that. In the arrangement view, you can see I have tracks here. We have our master output here. The cool thing about Ableton is that there's not really that many pop-up windows or really much clutter to speak of. So that's a huge pro of this software compared to other ones. It's just sleek, it's minimalist, everything works really fast, it's very snappy, and it's just the best in that regard. All right, now I'm gonna show you around some of the design elements in Studio One. So as you can see immediately, there's a lot going on compared to Ableton, but everything's laid out really, really well, and the design and the look has come a long way. So this is a very, very good program. But the first thing you'll notice, first of all, is the top bar has quite a lot more. So we have actual tools. So these are more traditional DAW tools like slicing and eraser and these types of things that Ableton does not use at all. We have different quantizing things and snap features here that are really useful. So again, more traditional DAW style tools at the top. And then there's a few other bells and whistles here, like a scratch pad that you can use to put ideas to the side if you're not sure if you want them in the song. And they also have a scene or clip view thing here, which basically mimics Ableton. And then on the left, we have our tracks, but what's kind of neat, and this is sort of similar to like Logic and Cubase and other DAWs that are more traditional, is you have an inspector here, which gives you a bunch of different options that you can control per track. So while Ableton had its browser on the left, Studio One has an inspector on the left, and there's more to this. You know, there's a groups panel, so there's a couple different panels that essentially stack on the left hand side. So it's definitely a bit more cluttered, but I really like the way that it looks and the way that it works. And then on the other hand, on the right side, this is where our browser is. And we'll take a look at the browser in more detail in its own section, but that's just where that is. And then on the bottom panel, we have either a mix view or an edit view. And then on the bottom, this is where our transport is located. So some people will probably take some time to get used to this because you might expect this to be at the top, but I find that it works really well. The transport has a bunch of things that you would need to record, like punching in, different metronome settings that have pop-up windows and those types of things. So I find this transport very well designed, actually. One great thing about Studio One that I actually haven't really seen before is that you can use your mouse scroll wheel or your scroll gesture on a trackpad to change pretty much everything. So let's just look at this as an example. If I select all these tracks and I scroll over the track color, look at that. So it's super fast and super fun to change little parameters like that. Same thing for track sizes. So I'm just scrolling over here. Same thing for mixing. If you scroll over this, it moves things around. So I find that to be very tactile, very, very cool feature. And then as far as some other design things that you need to know about, there is another detachable window kind of up here that you use for macros and things like that. So that is actually really, really cool because it's right there on the screen and it's very, very handy. I just wanted to note one thing about using Studio One is that there are actually different track types, which you don't really see in Ableton. So as you can see here, we have an arranger track, and then there's also a marker track. So you can add markers in different places. So that's really, really cool. There is also a ruler track. So there's just different track types in Studio One. And I kind of wish Ableton had that. I think it'd be really, really cool. So Studio One has quite a few more pop-up windows, but nothing too crazy. Everything that you need is really on the screen. It's not quite as minimalist in design as Ableton. There's quite a lot more. Like, for example, if I right click this audio file here, we get a lot of different options, and these are kind of nested menus that you'll have here. So look how extensive all these different functions are. So the design is quite different, but they've really found a good balance of having a lot of features for different types of producers, but kind of keeping most of the handy things in the main window, not having anything too complicated. It works very, very well. The next section is going to be talking about the browser. So browsing can actually be a huge aspect of modern music production workflow because we have so many loops and samples and things to be browsing from, plugins, all that stuff. So the browser is kind of like the centerpiece of the DAW at this point, and in Ableton, it is no joke. The browser in Ableton is one of the best that you'll find. It's very fun to use, it's very sleek. The way that the Ableton browser works is that we have a bunch of collections up top here so you can tag anything that you're using. So I find that to be really helpful, speeds up my workflow like crazy. All these plugins are just drag and drop. You can even drag and drop stuff from the browser while you're recording, which is huge. Then you have the Ableton included stuff like stock plugins. They have samples and different grooves and basically a bunch of stuff that you can use. And also there's a templates section here that I use a lot to organize my templates, and this is huge for speeding up workflow. I have videos devoted to this, and it's great. Now at the bottom, you can pretty much add any file from your computer, and it actually continually updates it. So I find this to be very user-friendly. You just press this add folder here. And one of the things that makes Ableton really stand out from any other program, so I have a sampler right here, and I want to actually replace this sample. What I can do is I can press this button called Hot Swap, and it will let you replace it with any other sample, which I haven't seen in another DAW. It is such a time saver, it's so useful. And one step further, Ableton will auto-detect similar samples for you that you can swap out. So sample management, browsing in Ableton is unmatched. I just want to talk briefly about some of the things that they changed in the new version that I've found to be a little bit sluggish, and hopefully this gets fixed soon. But basically they added these little filters that you can use to sort through stuff, and I think that's cool, but it just takes a while to go through all your things and add filters, and it just is a little laggy. Another thing that's really cool about the Ableton browser, in addition to hot swapping, is you can just save stuff, or you can just drag stuff right in. So it's super useful for organizing your racks, and it just feels very creative and fun to use. Okay, so Studio One's browser is seriously no joke. It's really, really good. It's hard for me to choose a favorite between the two, but I'm going to just show you a couple things about the Studio One browser so you can see if this would work better for you. So the Studio One browser has a really interesting tab system. So it's kind of like using Google Chrome or something. You can flip between instruments and effects and files and stuff using this system. So one of the things that I should point out that took me quite a while to figure out about this is that when you want to save your own files, we call them sound sets in Studio One. And when you have a sample folder that you want to add to Studio One's library, you basically have to right click it and you have to click pack sound set from folder. And then what happens is it saves it in your sound sets folder here. So it scans through everything. So it's just a little bit of an extra step. I like how Ableton just kind of has whatever files you want to attach there and it scans it automatically. But in any case, you can add your own files and then you can create tabs for different things. So let's say I want a whole tab for kicks. You can do new tab from here. So I think this is really cool. Now I can kind of bounce between different things. So you sort of have an extra dimension there and it organizes everything really well. You can actually create your own folders, which is nice. It's very robust. So I have this categorized by plugin manufacturers. You can have images in here, select samples. If we double click it, it's going to audition it. You have some options here if you want to sync it to tempo or loop it. Also, I just want to show you one quick thing that Studio One does that I think is really, really neat. Let's just say we have these hi-hat samples in our beat right here. I just dragged in audio. Let's say we want to swap them out for a different sample. If you hold Option and drag it in, it will replace all of them. So that's really cool. Almost hot swapping like Ableton, but a bit different. And then, of course, in the new version of Studio One, they just added Splice, which is just built right into the browser. So if this is something that you want to use, I mean, look at how sick this is. This is really, really cool, especially if you're a Splice user. So just to conclude this section, Ableton, I would say their browser has kind of been like the benchmark for a really long time because it's super easy to use, it's super sleek, and it has hot swapping, which just makes beat making and swapping out samples for drums and stuff really, really fun and easy. But that being said, Studio One has an incredible browser. So we have a tab system, we have Splice built right in. So it's really hard to choose a favorite. It just kind of depends on what you want to do. I think they're both almost equal to each other, but I'm going to give a slight advantage to Ableton because hot swapping is really cool. All right, let's talk about recording audio. So this is going to be a section where I think Ableton really falls short of other DAWs, and I've been hoping that they would improve some things with this because it's only a few small things. It's just not really catered towards recording audio, but I do it all the time and it works fine. I think a lot of the other pros of Ableton sort of outweigh the time that you waste doing audio recording and stuff like that. So let's just look at a couple things that you need to know if you're recording audio. So it has this interesting monitoring setting right here that's either set to off, auto, or in. So essentially these buttons decide how you're going to be monitoring. So that's really important to know about. And they also added this new feature called keep latency. That's this little button on the right hand side that you need to uncheck so that it does not keep latency, because Ableton had a latency problem while recording for many years and it was such a headache. But now they fixed that, so it's definitely improving. Another thing you need to know for audio recording is that you can punch in and punch out with these buttons. So I have those mapped to key commands, so those are essential. And another thing that you should know is your count in option is right here. You cannot use the keyboard shortcut to set this, so that's really annoying. But if you click this little arrow next to the metronome, you can set a count in if you want. As far as recording is concerned, you can map the record button using this key function here, and you can map the punch in and punch outs. Besides that, there aren't really too many crazy recording functions. So it definitely works well for recording when you get the hang of things, but it has a couple little quirks and just in general isn't really designed with recording audio in mind. I will say one thing that's super cool about recording with Ableton is you can drag and drop audio plugins right onto a track while you're recording and it will not interrupt the recording. It will not have pops and clicks and stuff in the audio, which is super cool if you're working on the fly. Okay, so let's talk about recording in Studio One. So the first thing you probably need to know is about monitoring. There's a dedicated monitor button right here. And just so you know, there's a bit of a setting here that decides how you want Studio One to behave as far as monitoring. So you may or may not want this button to trigger the monitoring and so on. So that's really cool to have a dedicated button for that. Recording in this program is very, very straightforward. Down here we have some settings for different recording modes. It's a little more sophisticated than Ableton. We also have pre-roll, punching in and punching out, and your metronome options. And another cool thing that really boosts my workflow speed for recording is that you can duplicate tracks without data in Studio One. So I have that mapped to a key command, but let's just say I want to record another guitar with the same stuff on this track, but just no audio there. I can just duplicate without data, and now I have another guitar palm mute 2 that is empty and ready to record with the same routing and everything. So a huge workflow boost. You cannot do that in Ableton. So as far as like traditional recording features, just from a linear DAW, Studio One is much better. There's just a lot more details to specific recording workflows that you might need, like for punching in. You can map key commands to your metronome, click, count offs. You can do pre-roll and all that stuff just a little bit easier with key commands. So I like Studio One if you're just going to be recording a lot of audio. Let's say you're recording guitars, drums, bass, that kind of stuff. Studio One would definitely be a lot better and more user-friendly for that. So let's talk about editing audio. This is another section that, as you might expect, Ableton just really doesn't do it for me, but I've gotten so used to doing this over the years that it's kind of whatever. But there are a couple key commands that are super essential for editing audio quickly, and Ableton just doesn't really have them, so it is what it is. Let's just look at some audio right here in this session that I've edited. So if you want to split something, you can press Command E and it will do that, but you will have to erase that manually. There's no key command to do all of that. And so pretty much your editing, your fades, all this needs to be done with your mouse or your trackpad. And there's not very many dedicated key commands to do that kind of stuff like you would find in Pro Tools or Studio One or pretty much any other DAW. And I've been hoping that they would add this for years, but they have not. I'm just going to show you real quick what it entails to comp stuff in Ableton, which works really well, and I love using it. So we just have some vocals here. We have some different lanes. It automatically records takes to these different lanes. You don't have to set anything up. It's just super foolproof. Let's just say I like the way that this first take sounds. You just press enter and it just moves it right up. And Ableton always has fades right here. It's not super robust, but it works really well, and I enjoy using it a lot. So if you're editing like a lot of audio, for example, like recording drums with 10 microphones or something, it's gonna be such a pain, but you can get around it. It just takes a little bit of extra work. All right, let's talk about audio editing in Studio One. This is a huge category for Studio One, and I'm really impressed because I would say it actually holds a candle to Pro Tools for audio editing. It's not quite there, but it's really, really, really good. So I'm just going to show you a couple things that I find really useful. So all the key commands that Ableton does not have. For example, let's say if we want to cut this like that, that's just one key command. And let's just say I want to cut everything after the cursor, we can do that. If I wanted to crop something, so let's just say I wanted only this piece of audio, boom, crop. That's just one key command here. So really, really awesome that you can do that. Other things that you might need to do for editing audio, there is a whole panel of useful functions here. So we can strip silence. Let's just say there's some noise or whatever in the vocals. We can set this and then dial it in and it will do that, which is amazing. I mean, that saves you so much editing time if you know how to dial this in. Absolutely incredible. I'm going to show you real quick this macro toolbar, which is incredible. It's really well integrated into the program. So you can actually download people's macro toolbars from the internet. But I'm just going to use this one, let's say. So it has a bunch of different macros that you can map to key commands. So this one is gain stage to -3 dB, so that will change the gain staging for that. There's just a whole bunch of different things that you can do. You can have it load plugins for you. I'm not going to get super in detail to that, but basically all you need to know is if there's some repetitive functions that you're using a lot, you can map a macro and essentially assign one key command to do 2, 3, 4, 5 different things that you normally find yourself doing, and that is huge. So comping. This one works really well in Studio One. So when you open up your take lanes here with this button, you basically have to highlight what you want and then it'll move it up there, so you can do that. So that's kind of how comping works. Another audio editing task is doing fades. So you can set a key command to do fades, or you can just click and drag like that. So for doing fades, there's no fade dialog box or anything. You basically just have to assign a key command and tell it how long of a fade you want, and then if you want to change it, you just drag it here. So it's not as good as Pro Tools, but you can still do fades pretty easily, and at least there's key commands for it, unlike Ableton. Up here, another thing that's really handy for people doing a lot of audio editing is we have different snap modes. And we also have relative grid mode, which Ableton kind of does automatically, but it's nice to be able to switch between that on and off. You can also snap to events, which is really cool. And there's also a ripple edit mode, which is really handy if you've ever used shuffle mode in Pro Tools or like a video editing software. If there's back-to-back audio that you want to kind of shuffle around, it will do that. Here's another cool thing that I didn't show you. So if you open up this bend marker panel, we can analyze, and then what you can do is you can slice. and hit that, and boom, you get slices. So really, really cool. Studio One has a grouping feature. So if we want to group 2 tracks, we can do that, and they come up here, and you can decide what gets adjusted within the group. So this is huge. Ableton doesn't have this. Ableton, you're able to link tracks, but it's not very robust. So this is great if you're working with groups. So now anytime I edit this, they both move around, and then anytime I edit a particular thing on the channel, right, they're both linked together. So that's grouping. So just to conclude this audio editing section, if you're primarily doing audio editing, you're probably not watching this video anyway because you already use Pro Tools. But if you're looking for a program that has a lot of the common audio editing workflows distilled into a sleek package that's fun to use, I think Studio One really nails it. In our next section, we're going to talk about warping. I added a whole category for this because this is something that's so critical to my workflow when I'm writing music or producing. Ableton is incredible if you need a warp or time stretch audio. If you're not familiar with this process, it takes a little bit of time to get used to it, but if you know how to do this really well in Ableton, you can do some crazy stuff. So think about like remixing, changing the tempo and keys of your songs. There's just a lot of different things that you can do, and literally no DAW has come close to the workflow of this in Ableton in my personal experience. So I'll just give you just a quick demo of what it entails to warp something in Ableton. And basically I just have this like guitar sample that's right here. What you can do is you can double click on any of these markers, and essentially what it'll let you do is it'll let you stretch audio. So if you want to make your performance perfect, or if you want to, you know, change the timing of something, it's really handy for that. You have a bunch of different modes that you have to learn how to use for different things. I tend to prefer Complex and Complex Pro. I just haven't really found that other DAWs sound as good. When you have warp enabled and you have your markers here, everything can get time aligned, and then you can actually change the tempo or the key of your song using this pitch knob. Here's what Ableton sounds like when it's warping an entire song. So I have all these audio stems here, and it's supposed to be at 90 BPM, so I'll play that first. Here's the same thing at 80 BPM. Here's 70 BPM. So I'll do 100 BPM. And here's 120 BPM. All right, we're gonna look at warping in Studio One now. This is actually called bending in this program. So first of all, there's an amazing bend panel right here. I wish Ableton had something like this, but basically what you do is you kind of tell it to analyze the audio. So I just dragged in the stems, the exact same thing that we looked at in Ableton. And what it does is it puts markers everywhere, which is super useful. You can adjust the threshold and whatnot. So I really like this because sometimes in Ableton you have to do more manual stuff. This kind of just does it automatically for you. You could slice it, you can quantize it, so really handy. So just one quick thing that I like to do, this panel here is a little bit annoying. Actually, I'm dragging up this bottom thing. I want to just make sure the file tempo is set correctly for everything. So this originally was at 90 BPM. And then over here in the inspector, so if you press this I button, we can look at the inspector. So for each track, you can see we need to set this to time stretch. And then, you know, for some of them, I set it to drums, and then we set follow global transpose, which is this new feature down here, which I'll show you in a second. So I just basically set the tune mode for the different instruments. So for bass, it's bass. And so this is how you set up the warping characteristics. And so now we'll just listen to this at the normal tempo first. All right, let's slow this thing down to 80. Let's hit 70. Okay, let's speed up. We're going to 100. Let's try 120. Now I'm going to show off this transpose feature that they added, so let's just take the whole song down one semitone. Let's hear what that sounds like. Let's do another one. And maybe I'll try going up by 4. So my assessment is that Ableton is just so much better at doing warping and pitch changes for remixing and doing those types of things. They just sound so much better to me. I think this needs to be like a #1 priority for Studio One to figure out, especially since they added that transpose button, because it could be so cool. I love the bend panel where you can analyze the audio and do all. It really just takes a lot of work away from what you would normally have to do in Ableton. But at the end of the day, if it doesn't sound good, I'm not sure. But either way, you can definitely do warping in both of the programs. You just need to know how to set it up correctly. I think Ableton is just the king of that. Recording MIDI in Ableton is actually really easy and straightforward, and you can also use the exact same comping feature as audio, so I can just comp different MIDI takes here. I love loop recording in Ableton, so you can just keep recording a little section over and over, and it will fill up these comping lanes here. We have something called the MIDI effect rack that you can use for a number of different things, actually. So this is really handy. I personally use it to label different keys for recording drums, but I've seen people use it for live. And this MIDI effect rack is very powerful and it's very unique. And over here, there's a whole category of MIDI effects. So you can use an arpeggiator or a pitch adjustment, velocity editor. So you just drag them right into MIDI tracks and it'll change the MIDI that you're inputting on your keyboard. Recording MIDI is pretty straightforward, just works really well in Ableton. All right, now we're gonna look at recording MIDI in Studio One. So recording MIDI is great in Studio One. And one of the things that I actually wanted to point out that has been such a big frustration of mine in Ableton for many years is, look at this. Let's say I'm just recording MIDI here and there's nothing for a while, and then I start playing. Studio One automatically edits stuff for you when things like that happen. So for loop recording MIDI and just recording MIDI in general, Studio One has some really great features that make it a little bit easier on the editing front, I think. Another thing I wanted to mention about recording MIDI, if you are using external instruments like synthesizers and stuff, Studio One has a whole feature set that allows you to add external instruments in the program, so you can do that in the settings. And Ableton does have its own external instrument plugin as well, so you can do both with both programs. I just think Studio One has some cool options. So if you're doing that type of thing, you might want to look at those features. Now we're going to talk about editing MIDI, so this is where the two programs are going to differ a lot. So here's our MIDI editor window in Ableton. I'm just going to show you a couple cool things that you can do. So right here, I just have some drums that I was editing. So you can actually rename your keys, so you can have like a custom naming template, which is really cool. I have some of these on my website. When we look over here, this is kind of where a lot of things happen. So we can have scales to kind of have like a scale assistant if you want to know what the correct pitches are. So there's a drop down for all that, and they have some crazy scales. And we have a bunch of different options here, like you can half time or double time your song. You can humanize and legato. There's basically just a bunch of different useful tools that you can click here to edit the MIDI. In this second panel here, we have MIDI transformation. So the one that I use the most often is quantize, but you can do strum. You know, there's a bunch of different options here that will essentially transform any MIDI that you have selected. And then in this next window, we have MIDI generator effects. So you can essentially generate MIDI using these different things here. So I just wanted you to see some of these things because these are really unique. It's definitely a good reason to use Ableton if you're using MIDI generative effects or transformation. They're really good. And then as far as just like straight up MIDI editing here, it all works really straightforward. There's a couple key commands you need to know to adjust velocity and kind of just moving things around. If you right click, you have a drop down menu with a few things that you need to know about, so you can change to triplet grid and things like that, and there's useful key commands for doing that. Honestly, MIDI editing is pretty great in Ableton. It's just easy to understand, it's quick, it's not super robust, but it just does mostly what you need. And there's some other windows down here, so you can use envelopes to control your pitch bend and stuff like that. So MIDI editing is really nice in Ableton. It's pretty user friendly, but it does have a decent amount of stuff under the hood now because they added all these new features. So if you're doing a lot of MIDI editing, I would recommend checking it out, especially if you're making electronic music or doing beat making and stuff like that. Let's talk about editing MIDI a little bit in Studio One because it is quite a bit different than Ableton. So here we have our editor window. You can do this in a keyboard mode, and there's some other modes as well. We can do drums and score view. We're gonna look at the keyboard mode first. As you can see here, we have a whole quantize panel that you can use up top, as well as some other panels that you can open up, a macro panel. You have a side panel right here that has a couple different options. So it's just a very different system than Ableton. All of our velocity and pretty much whatever other parameters you want to add can be done down here. So that's really, really handy. I use obviously the quantize function a lot. So I like how there's a dedicated panel to this with quite a few more options than Ableton. So this is kind of nice, although you do have to open it up. Then they also added things like pitch visibility. So this is really, really good. You can show only used pitches, which is called folding in Ableton. So it's nice. Next, let's look at the drum workflow in Studio One. So this is actually pretty unique to this program. So as you can see, we have a drum editor workflow. Another thing that's unique to Studio One is that it actually has a pattern editor. So you can make drum beats this way if you prefer this look. So it's kind of like Logic, but Ableton doesn't have anything like this. You're just using the regular piano roll, and you can name everything. There's a bunch of extra features here, and it has these really neat things that you can, these buttons here that you can press that will insert stuff more easily for you and move them around. So that's really, really cool. And like Ableton, you can also pull up their drum plugin here. There's just no hot swap, but this is really, really good as well if you're doing drums. Another thing that's cool about Studio One's MIDI editor, as you can see, we have a bunch of tools that you can use. And there's also this action button that has a whole drop-down list of different things that you can do. So a lot to unpack here. Just to conclude this section, I'm not sure if one's better than the other. I don't really have a favorite for MIDI editing. I would say Ableton is probably a little bit heavier on the sort of generative effects type thing. So if you're into that, maybe for like electronic production or whatever, that would be ideal. If you want something a little more traditional, look at Studio One. It's got the drum editor, it's got the piano roll, it's got tools. So I find that they actually are both really, really good, just very different. The next section's included audio plugins. So Ableton comes packed with a bunch of audio plugins, and this actually varies depending on which version you decide to purchase for Ableton. I have Suite, so I have all of them, so it might be more or less depending on which version you get. But I'm just going to show you a couple cool ones that I find really, really useful. So we'll start with EQ8. This is a beautiful EQ that's very, very easy to use, and you can open it up right in the GUI, and I think this is really fast. Another plugin I use all the time is this glue compressor, an SSL style bus compressor designed by Cytomic, and it's great. Both of these are great. A new one that they just released this year is called Roar, which is a multi-band distortion plugin, distortion saturation plugin, whatever you want to do with it. It has crazy modes, and it's really, really good. I love that. And it has zero latency too, so that's awesome. Ableton has an amazing tuner. I know that sounds like the most boring plugin ever, but if you're recording guitar or trying to tune 808s and stuff like that, it's very accurate and very useful. I've yet to find a better one in the DAW. Another plugin that I think is really cool that they have is called Drum Bus. So you can just put this on your drum group and it has a bunch of useful stuff. All in all, Ableton has an amazing array of audio processing plugins just included right with the software. They work really well. They don't crash. They tend to be very, very low latency, and they're great. Okay, let's just look at Presonus Studio One's included effect plugins. So we're in the effects category here. So there's quite a lot to go through. I'm just going to pull up a couple just so you can get an idea of what's going on. Definitely not as much quantity as Ableton, but there are some very, very good ones. So let's look at this Fat channel that I use a lot. So this one's a channel strip plugin, but what's really nice is you can actually use different plugin emulations here. So if you just open this up, we can put 2BQ, we can stack them up like this. So very, very nice channel strip plugin that they include that I use all the time, and it's really good on latency. Let's check out red light distortion. I like this plugin a lot, just a distortion box. And here's their standard in the box compressor. So they're pretty straightforward. I would definitely give the edge to Ableton. Ableton's got a bunch of really interesting creative effects. Studio One's definitely got what you need. Everything sounds good and works really well. Very easy to use, very easy to dial in. Everything looks good, but there's just more stuff in Ableton and just like, quite frankly, some weirder stuff going on in Ableton. So if you're looking for more creative effects, definitely check out Ableton. Now we're going to talk about Ableton's included instruments and sounds. It comes with a ton of preloaded instruments and sounds, and if I'm going to be completely honest with you, I actually don't really use too much stock instruments and sounds because I have my own third-party plugins, and I also spend a lot of time recording instruments that I play. But if you're looking for a lot of different synths and sounds and loops and all kinds of stuff, Ableton has a ton of it. And there's a lot of useful instruments here, different synthesizers that you can load up. They actually have multiple different samplers. So we have sampler and simpler and drum rack. So if you're sampling stuff like doing vocal chops or sampling vinyl or making hip hop beats or anything that requires sampling, it's really powerful for that kind of thing. So it's hard to beat, to be honest. But that being said, I don't really find myself using any of the bundled synths or the bundled loops and factory content just because, like I said, I record a lot of my own instruments, so I don't really need that stuff. But if you're just starting out, it's really handy to have all those loops. Nothing has really ever struck me as sounding amazing, but it's definitely a good starting point if you don't really use third-party instruments and if you don't use splice or anything like that. So there's a bunch of stuff included to get you started. It's definitely more electronic leaning though. Next, we'll look at Studio One's included instruments and sounds. Presonus, again, quite a bit more limited than Ableton. They have 2 samplers, so I use Impact all the time, obviously. So this one works really well. I like it a lot. There is this sample 1, so this one's just their standard sampler. And we have a couple different synths, so like this Deep Flight 1. I don't really use any of them. They look good, but it's just not as much stuff as Ableton as far as like actual synth and drum sampler plugins. They have their own whole catalog of loops that come included with the software and different sounds that you can download. Studio One has like a whole download portal pop-up window right here. If you click Studio One installation, you can go in here and download different things. So that's kind of cool. You can decide what you want and install things. So they both have plenty of things to work with, but definitely if you're looking for a lot of really interesting stock instruments and effects, go for Ableton for sure. It just comes with a lot more creative stuff included. In this next section, we're going to talk about plugin management and plugin handling in Ableton. So starting with stock plugins, the way that stock plugins work in Ableton is really, really unique and super fast because you don't need to open any other windows to adjust things. So if we look right here, I'm on my guitar channel. I have a tuner, I have an EQ that I can adjust right here without opening anything up, compression, pretty much whatever you want that's in their stock audio effects, you can just drag right here and make your own channel strip, and it's super fast and it's just really, really good. Then if you want to take things one step further, you can actually create your own macro adjustments that will control different things that you want to control. So I'm going to show you how that works actually on one of my vocal tracks. So here's a vocal track, and I designed all these Ableton racks that just have stock plugins in here that essentially are just being controlled with these macro knobs. It just makes my workflow really fast. I don't have to open anything up. It's just amazing. And I have these in my templates on my website, by the way, if you want to check these out. You want your workflow to be super fast for recording vocals. You barely have to do anything. Everything's already dialed in, and you can just adjust only what you need here, and you don't need to see anything else. So that's just like a quick look at what Ableton racks are able to do. There's definitely a lot more that you can do with Ableton racks, but as far as their stock plugins, I love the way that they're integrated in the software, and I think it works really quickly. So if you're using third-party plugins, I think their handling definitely falls a bit short. So there's not really any mixer view in Ableton where you can like move plugins around. Let's just say I wanted to add, this decapitator to a bunch of different channels all at once. I can't really do that without creating a group. So there's some limitations, right? So as you'll see in Studio One, you can move plugins right around in the mixer, so you can't do that in Ableton. Now I'm going to talk about plugin management in Studio One. So there's actually a lot to unpack in this section, unlike Ableton. So if you're the kind of person that has third-party plugins like myself, and you want to be using those in your productions, this is the section for you. So, and Studio One is probably the DAW for you as well. So let's just look at this. First of all, we'll start with the plugin manager window. You can access this by view and then going to plugin manager. We have a whole dedicated pop-up window to looking through all your plugins. It'll tell you which ones you're using the most often and all that. So it's really handy. If anything's crashing, you can block it. So this is really, really awesome. I find myself using this all the time. In addition to that, there is a performance window that you can pull up so you can see what devices are taking up your CPU and all that. So we got some cool pop-up windows for plugin related management. So check this out. This is one of the coolest things that I've seen in a DAW is that there's a tab view to switch between plugins on a specific channel. So I find this really, really quick for flipping between plugins and dialing them in. And then in addition to that, we have this whole channel strip view that we can see all the inserts and the sends and everything. And we have a whole routing view. So you can do similar things in Ableton, but I just like the way that this is visually laid out. It's just a really cool way of managing your plugins. And then we haven't even looked at the mixer. So when we open up the mixer now, check out how these plugins are handled. So for example, let's just say I want to drag this decapitator to 3 of these tracks. I just select these and boom, watch this. It just loads them up on all 3. We can also load inserts over here. So if you prefer to do it this way, it even has a recents tab, which is really cool. So great plugin management in Studio One. This is what I'm referring to by plugin management. If you use third-party plugins or any plugins in general, it's really easy to move them around, load them up different ways. It's really easy to flip between different ones that you're using. So amazing. I really like Studio One for using third-party plugins for sure. All right, let's talk about making beats in Ableton. So this is a great program to do that in. One of the highlights is this drum rack, which is literally perfectly integrated into the whole ecosystem. So they just released this new drum sampler. This has a bunch of cool controls that you can use to manipulate your samples. And this whole thing works really well. You can hot swap your sample. So if you don't like this snare, I can just switch it with a different one in any of the folders that I have. And it works great. So beat making is totally a breeze in Ableton. There's great MIDI effects, MIDI generative and transformative effects. You have great samplers for both drums and actually tuned instruments. You got great plugins to process all of them and do creative things. And in addition to that, you can warp audio really, really well. So if you're trying to flip samples, detune them, change the timing of samples, all that stuff, it is absolutely wonderful in this program. It's hard to say if there really would be anything better. All right, let's talk about Studio One in the beat making category. So it has a lot to offer in the beat making category, actually. As we talked about briefly earlier, we have this whole dedicated drum editor, which is really cool. So we can use different tools to make drum beats this way. And if you prefer to actually work using more of a pattern sequencer workflow, right, we can convert part to pattern and then make beats this way. So you can do this, it'll enter stuff in for you. So I think it's a really, really nice program for making beats. Let's look at the impact instrument. So if we open this up right here, we have a drum pad sampler, which is really, really nice. So I think for beat makers, using Studio One could be a move. Probably Ableton just a slighter edge, just because it's a little bit more catered towards electronic production. It's got all the warping and stuff super, super streamlined, but Studio One is definitely up there for sure. Okay, so let's talk about vocal production in Ableton. It definitely has some limitations, but I'm gonna show you some cool things about it. So comping works really, really well. You can just select what you want and press enter. Additionally, if you're manipulating vocals, like changing the pitch or warping them or doing anything like that for doing vocal chops and stuff like that, it's really handy for doing that. It's very, very good. Doing things like pitch correction with Melodyne in Ableton is very, very slow because there's no ARA functionality, so you have to open up the Melodyne window and scan things in, and it's really annoying. They do have their auto shift plugin that they released that's kind of similar to Auto-Tune EFX. Another thing that I wanted to mention related to vocal production is doing effects, different vocal effects and stuff like that. It's really easy to just drag and drop stuff in and come up with some creative things. You can use the grouping feature like I have here, right? I can group everything. So to do that, you just select the tracks you want and press Command G and it will create a group, and then you can just drag effects onto that whole group. So it's really, really good for doing that. But the sends and returns, like aux channels in Ableton, are a little bit frustrating, and I'm gonna get more into that in the mixing section, but you'll kind of see what I'm talking about when you see Studio One. So as far as vocal production overall in Ableton, I don't know if it's really catered towards that. You can definitely make some really, really cool stuff with some workarounds, but there's not really any specific features other than comping and the auto shift plugin that are specifically for vocal production. But I like using it for songwriting and stuff like that, but I think Studio One's definitely a little bit better for vocal production. So one of the first things is comping. So it's really easy, really streamlined. It adds fades for you automatically. So this is wonderful for comping. Just look at how we can just have Melodyne in here, and that's just like quite incredible. So like if you've Melodyne this vocal, you can just move this around, which is such a pain in Ableton. So that's really, really cool to be able to just Melodyne, and you can do vocal line and stuff like that just built right in using ARA. It's been working really well for me. Another thing I just want to note for vocal production is there's a great send system that you can use here. So, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in mixing, but basically like it's just drag and drop. So if you want reverb as a send, you just drag it from the browser right on the channel, as I've done here. Okay, so as you can see, we can have effect sends that have obviously a chain of effects. We can route them however we want. So it's really, really nice to have that kind of traditional aux channel setup. So for vocal production, for doing creative effects, it's really, really cool. Mixing in Ableton, of course it is possible to make great mixes in Ableton, but it's not really catered towards that in my experience. But that being said, they have improved the faders a little bit. I find myself just clicking on the channel and just using my up and down arrow keys to control this. You can also adjust some important things over here. You know, we can control the volume here with up and down arrow as well as the panning. Not super ideal for mixing in like a traditional DAW sense. And then the other issue is that there's no plugin management for third-party plugins. So I can't like take a plugin and put it on like 3 or 4 tracks at once. Also, if I need to move this plugin to multiple other channels, that's really annoying. You have to hold Alt and then drag it over one at a time and that kind of thing. So if you're using a lot of third-party plugins, it's not great, but the stuff that's built in works really, really well, and that can be a huge workflow boost. So I find myself, when I'm using Ableton, try to stick to stock plugins as much as I can. They're just really well integrated in the whole ecosystem. So mixing on those is definitely quite nice. Let's talk about the Ableton sends and returns, which have been a problem for a really long time and drives me crazy. But let's say we want to put reverb on this track, right? You can choose this A knob and just send your track to this return. The problem with this is you can't group these, you can't move them around, they're stuck here. And also if you have quite a few of them, look at what this looks like, it's crazy, right? I would prefer to have my return tracks in the actual group. So for example, if I had vocal reverb, I would have that in the acapella group. So a lot of issues with the return track. So from a mixing standpoint, it's definitely, you have to just kind of work around some of these things. And yes, it will be fast and sleek if you know what you're doing, but it just doesn't really seem like it's tailored towards mixing for obvious reasons. Mixing in Studio One's really fun. Like I talked about earlier, the plugin management is great. We can load plugins from right here. We can load plugin chains from right here. Everything's drag and drop from the browser. So if you have an effect or even a folder of effects that you use, you can just drag them right in. They keep track of your recent effects, so you can just drag those right over. Let's look at how easy it is to create buses and stuff. Let's just say I want to create a bus for these guitars. I can add an effects channel like this. There's actually multiple different ways of doing it, but look how fast that just happened. Now I have an extra effect channel. So there's a whole bunch of different mixing features that I probably can't even cover, but basically there's grouping features which doesn't even exist in Ableton, so that's amazing for editing as well. We have scenes, so you can save mix snapshots, which is awesome. So just a ton of cool features there. You can also even monitor all your input channels. So you can see these are my audio interface inputs. And if you want to bake in effects there, you can do that. So that's really, really cool. Another quick thing I just wanted to add about Studio One mixing is that you have this option to use event effects. So this is really handy. This is something that you would use in like Pro Tools and Cubase. But basically, if you want to just drag one effect for this particular clip and nothing else, and print it down, there's an event effects section here where you can add whatever inserts and then you can render that. So that's really, really handy if you don't want the plugins cluttering up your mixer. You just need an effect on one little thing. Ableton doesn't really have anything like that. You just have to freeze and flatten the whole track, but in Studio One you have an option of putting event effects on things and printing it down, so it's really cool. Now we'll talk about mastering in Ableton. So you can master in any DAW. Doesn't seem like Ableton has that much stuff going on that's specifically catered towards mastering, but I'll just show you a couple quick things. We have a spectrum analyzer here that we can make full screen. They just redesigned this limiter, which I'm really excited to use. And the EQ8 actually works really well for mastering purposes too, because it has a mid-side mode and a left and right mode, so it can get pretty detailed. But yeah, no real specific mastering features in Ableton like you'll see in Studio One. So Studio One for mastering, it actually has a whole dedicated page that you can access. So basically what happens is when you create a new session, you just go to the templates and do master and release here. It has a whole separate window for this. So this is really cool. Can't really compare it to Ableton because it doesn't have anything like this, but as you can see, we have a bunch of metering and we have a dedicated mastering page. So I think that's amazing. I'm not going to go into too much detail on this mastering page because I haven't used it too much, but it looks like they've thought through mostly everything. If you're interested in mastering and want a dedicated page for that, that with features like metering and scopes and stuff like that. Really, really cool offering with Studio One here. So in this section, we're going to be talking about performing live. So Ableton Live is designed to perform live. So I've used it in a band context, like doing playback tracks, and I've also used it to DJ. So either of those two things are a great use of Ableton. You should definitely be using Ableton if you're performing live. So as far as playback is concerned, it's actually pretty straightforward. So it's a very, very reliable DAW to have on stage if you need to play back tracks. Like if you're a solo performer, or even if you're playing in a band and you need tracks to be playing, it's pretty much industry standard for live performers to have this on tours. So you can do in-ears mixes on it if you want. I have a bunch of count-off tracks that I've mapped in a drum rack that basically have like count-offs where it's like chorus 1, 2, 3, 4, all that stuff you can map in Ableton, and it's really easy to use for that. On another note, if you're DJing in Ableton, this would be a great program to use as well as an alternative to, you know, let's say using CDJs or vinyl or whatever. So the way that it works is you can take loops, like drum loops or full songs, and play them right here in clip view. You can play the whole row if you want, and you can use the tempo function to change tempos if everything's warped enabled. If you press this button here and enable the crossfader, you can crossfade between two things. So if you want this to be A and B, we can crossfade between the two. So it's super neat for DJing. It will even actually follow, using this follow feature, it will follow like a drummer or something if you want to stay on tempo with someone. These two buttons right here are really cool. So if you click this, it's kind of like slowing down a turntable. And if you click this one, it's like speeding up a turntable. So you can actually like beat match Ableton to something else. There's a ton of cool plugins that you could use for DJing, like beat repeat and EQs and stuff like that. So it's just really catered towards it. If you're interested in that, there's a ton of info on this online, but look no further. Ableton's perfect for that, for electronic DJing as well as playback. So playback could be playing in a band or could be solo performer like a singer-songwriter. I've used it for, you know, big tours. People use it for church. People use it for just playing local gigs. So it's great for all that. As far as performing live in Studio One, I'm not going to go into too much detail on this. It looks really cool, and I'm definitely going to check this out. I want to try to use this for some live sets. Good to know that you can do this type of thing in Studio One, but if you're performing live, you really just got to check out Ableton Live. It is the business for that. The next section, we're going to talk about customizability in Ableton. So this is kind of interesting because Ableton is very customizable kind of in its own way, but there's a couple things that aren't customizable, so it's kind of strange, but let me just show you as an example. If we press this key button, we can customize keyboard shortcuts for any of the things that are highlighted. But that doesn't allow you to customize keyboard shortcuts for everything, like Studio One. But it is cool. You can do the same thing with MIDI as well if you want to program a MIDI button to control everything. Another thing that's really cool for customizability is Max for Live. So there's a bunch, you can design plugins for Ableton if you want to do that, or you can get third-party Max for Live plugins that do a bunch of stuff. Probably a little out of the scope of this video, but basically there's a ton of different Max for Live plugins that you can get, and you can actually program these and customize them if you want. Another thing that I showed you earlier is that I have designed my own racks. You can get these types of things from my website, but here's an example of a click track rack that I have. So you can customize little buttons, label everything, color everything, and these control specific things like effect parameters or whatever you want. So there are a lot of cool things that are customizable in Ableton, but you cannot customize all of the keyboard shortcuts for the whole program, which is a bummer. Next, we'll talk about customization in Studio One. So I really like how they have a keyboard shortcuts editor in the preferences. So you can search for anything that the software does and assign a key command here, and it's really, really easy to use, and you can save your own scheme. So that's amazing. Every program should have that. I don't really know why Ableton doesn't have that. And then let's look at macros too. We have a macro organizer pop-up window. So if you want to design your own macro, so for example, here's one that I made, and basically what it does is it loops whatever you have selected, it turns on the loop, and then it locates the selection. So there's just a bunch of different macros you can make. You can get macros online from people. So pretty much any sequence of events that you need to map, like here's someone, so one of the included ones is if you want to add +1 dB to something. It's pretty much endless, honestly, and Cubase does this type of thing too, but I think Studio One's just a little easier to understand. So it works really, really well here. So you can do custom macros. Another thing with the customization is that you can do a little bit more detailed customization of the GUI here. So here's the adjustments. I don't really want to mess with this now, but you get the idea. So comparing Ableton and Studio One as far as customization, they're just both a bit different. So I want to give Ableton credit. It does have some really cool workflow for customizing things like mapping knobs and buttons, and you can design Max for Live plugins, which is all really, really cool. But for basic customization, I think Studio One takes the cake for me because you have macros, keyboard shortcut editor window, and you can customize the layout a little bit more. All right, now I'm gonna rate both DAWs for specific jobs that I think people are gonna be wondering which one's gonna suit their needs better. So first we'll start for musicians. So if you're a musician, I would definitely recommend checking out Ableton Live because the way that it works just feels a little bit more like an instrument. It's very snappy, it's very sleek, it has great warping. I think it's a great tool to use to practice with. You can slow down audio really easily. I think it would work really, really well for a musician. But on the other hand, if you're a musician in a band or something and you need to record a bunch of audio like your drummer playing or like your band rehearsals or something, I would definitely check out Studio One because it's going to be a lot easier to record higher track counts with groups of stuff and just more microphones and things like that. So it kind of just depends on that front. Next, for songwriting, if you're a songwriter, I would recommend you check out Ableton Live. I think it's just easier to move through ideas quickly. It's also easier to change tempos and keys of different ideas, so you can just basically change your songs very drastically. And if you're just songwriting, you might not need to be doing any complicated recording. You can just use loops. It works really well with loops. You can record your own stuff. You can warp them really easily. So for songwriting, Ableton's really hard to beat. It just works so quickly. That being said, Studio One could still work for you. It just has a lot more detailed features for audio editing and things like that. But I would definitely go for Ableton if you're a songwriter and you want just something that's very simplistic and that will allow you to move through a lot of different ideas quickly. Next category is production. So if you're a producer, this could vary widely depending on the genre, but loosely speaking, if you work more on loop-based music like electronic music and hip-hop, I think Ableton's by far going to be the best. But if you're recording a lot more live instruments, maybe doing some vocal production with Melodyne and things like that, definitely look at Studio One. It's just got more detailed editing tools. It's got the ARA functionality, and I think it'll work really well. Next category is engineering. So typically, professional engineers and studios will be using Pro Tools. But if you're looking for something a little bit more creative, a little more fun and sleek and easy to use, I think Studio One's a great option. It seems to have really, really thought through features for audio recording and mixing. On the other hand, I think Ableton just doesn't really have features tailored towards audio engineers. So editing audio, slicing stuff up, strip silence, a lot of that stuff just doesn't really exist. So I wouldn't really recommend Ableton if you're interested in audio engineering or mixing. That being said, you can do it. There's workarounds for a lot of things, but I just think Studio One is designed a little bit more with that in mind, like a more traditional DAW. Next category is composition. So if you're interested in composing for film and that type of thing, definitely look at Studio One, although typically I think most people doing that would probably be using Cubase. It's a little bit more robust for composition, but Studio One has scoring and it has just a bunch of features that would be a little bit more useful for scoring to video and Dolby Atmos and all those things that you may be using for that. Ableton just has nothing really to speak of in that category, so I would not use Ableton altogether. Next category is performing live and DJing. So as I've explained numerous times in this video, Ableton is designed around that. So a ton of touring DJs, bands, and even churches and stuff like that use Ableton Live for playback as well as DJing. It's really, really good, really flexible for that, very reliable. I would definitely check out Ableton Live if you're trying to perform live or a DJ. Now, the last thing I want to mention is value for the money. So Ableton offers different tiers depending on how many features you need. So there's intro, standard, and suite. The suite is very expensive, so I believe it's upwards of $700, whereas Studio One, if you want to buy it outright, is $200, which actually competes with Logic, which is crazy. But Studio One is also selling a subscription, which over time may amount to more money. So it's interesting that Ableton is actually quite a bit more expensive if you want to buy the suite, and then Studio One, if you want all the features, updating continually, you're going to need to subscribe. So it depends on what you want to do there. I can't really say which one is better value for the money, but at face value, Studio One is cheaper if you want to just buy it outright. So I think that's a better value. Thanks so much for checking out my video. I really hope that this was helpful for you. I really enjoyed making this. Let me know in the comments what DAW you're using and what you thought about everything that I was saying. I would love to hear some feedback. Also, check out the link in the description if you want to directly support my channel. I have templates for sale up there and a UAD Apollo video course. If you use Apollo and you want to get your money's worth, learn how to run sessions and live shows really well in that, I explain everything in my video course. So I'll catch you all in the next video. Thanks so much for watching. Later.